Welcome to today's Daytime Dialogues. It's my great pleasure today to welcome a good friend, but really one of the most extraordinary leaders in American Jewish life today, Rabbi Steve Weil. Rabbi Weil currently is the CEO of the Friends of the IDF. Before that, he was 11 years at the Orthodox Union, where he served in the senior most capacities, finishing his tenure there as the senior managing director of the Orthodox Union. Before that, he was the rabbi of one of the most prominent congregations in America in Beth Jacob. Before that, he was also a rav in the Detroit area. And before that, he grew up on a farm. And so he has a great history, but the leadership that he brings to our community is something that is really, whatever I would say is not enough. And for anyone who's ever been with us to APAC, for example, the APAC Shabbaton grows because Rabbi Weil always happens to be one of their scholars in residence there. So I thank him for giving me this time today. I thank him for being the leader that he is. And it's a pleasure to welcome you, Rabbi Weil.
Rabbi Matenki, look, the real story is you've mentored us. You've been our friend and our mentor. I'm talking about the Orthodox rabbinate, not only the pulpit rabbinate, but you've been our mentor as educators. Mostos Torah and Mostot HaChinuch across this country, we call you at all hours of the night from all time zones. And I want to thank you for being our friend.
Well, thank you so much. And I appreciate those words, but especially my mother who will listen to this will also appreciate those words. So let me actually start from the beginning. I don't think I've ever really asked you about this. Your father was a cattle farmer and you grew up on a farm.
Yeah.
Like, was it a real, like a farm, like, we would imagine in the middle of nowhere? What was it?
Exactly. Our story is we were in the same town in Germany for almost 350 years. Most unfortunately, most branches of the family were shipped. They were shipped to actually Ishbitz and then from there to Belzec. But there were a couple of branches of the family that escaped, and we were one of them. And they were in the cattle business in Germany. In fact, they built a railroad from Würzburg to the town where my family's cattle business was. And they used to, the railway was strictly for cattle. And when we came to America, they came with nothing. So they had to work for a few years just to be able to raise enough money to put a down payment on a farm. And they went back into the cattle business.
Your family came before the war or after the war?
Their affidavit got out February 39 to England, and they got to the United States because my grandfather's sister and brother-in-law had been here, and they got here in 1940.
Wow, just in time.
They heard that there was cattle country, there were dairy cattle in Wisconsin and near Buffalo. They didn't know if there were any Jews in Wisconsin. They just didn't know anything about it, but they heard that there's a Jewish community. So we settled about 50 miles from Buffalo. There was a kosher butcher in Buffalo, that kind of a thing.
And you grew up working on this farm in addition to school and normal life.
Yeah, like from our public school, there were basically two types of kids. There were kids who were farmers, children of farmers. And then there were kids whose parents worked at a place called Harrison Radiator. It made all of the radiators, air conditioning, heating units for General Motors products. Those kids, after school, they could play sports and do extracurriculars. The farm kids had to go home, shovel manure, milk the cows, work the fields. So after school, we were right away, going to the barn.
Wow. And then you ended up in Yeshiva University. You ended up receiving an MBA at NYU, also my alma mater as well. And the rest is history, but that history has really been extraordinary. Over the years, you've seen American Jewry change. Even though it hasn't been that many years, you're still young. What are the big changes you've seen over the last decade in our community?
So I will speak globally, and I'll speak in terms of the Orthodox community. Globally, it's very scary. We're losing, this is the Aseret HaShvatim. We're losing the 10 tribes because people are so disconnected. And you have to understand their religion, their ideology are really progressive liberal values. And I'm not here this is not an issue of being conservative or progressive, but whatever one's ideology is, that defines their whole perspective. And the print that they see, the print news, the blogs that they're on, where they identify in terms of their social media, No, Israel just doesn't fit into that. And for that matter, many Jewish values don't fit into that. It's just something as simple as just the freedom of expression. There's no concept of Lashon Hara. There's no concept of Motzi Shem Ra. It's all narcissism. I can say because it's my right to say it. And that's scary. Our people, if I could use a historical example, to take under the Jews of the former Soviet Union, the Jews under Tsarist Russia, they had been so persecuted and so put down that they thought socialism was going to be their messiah. Until, of course, it turned on them and they became the wrath of the Communist Party. But they gave up 3,000 years of Jewish history and Jewish tradition and Jewish values and embraced socialism. We have a certain similar phenomena here. It's not because they think it's going to be the opiate to anti-Semitism. Here, it's just because life is so free and they embrace these values that they've thrown away something that they have no clue what they've thrown away.
And your work now with FIDF, with Friends of the IDF, how does that play out with it? Because Friends of IDF plays a critical role in supporting the Chayalim in Israel, and yet the connection to Israel is waning in the United States.
Absolutely. In other words, you look at the message that the founders of FIDF 40 years ago had. They were survivors. This was all about protecting the Jewish people. And there was a certain sense, where they almost worshiped the military because Jews had been beat up and picked on forever. That language does not work with American Jews under the age of 60. Any Jew who doesn't remember vividly going through 1967 or going through 1973 can't relate to that. In most American Jews, let's say 85% of American Jews under the age of 50, would identify as progressive or liberal. Now, there's no more progressive organization or institution than the IDF. When you look at enabling people to transcend the poverty level, when you look about it's the great unifier, the great equalizer, when you look at the investment in human capital and giving people a chance to make it, a second chance on life, whether it's because of their financial challenges, their family challenges, it's the Jewish army. It's like no other army on earth because of its values. We have to be able to take that and articulate that in a language that speaks to a liberal or to a progressive Jew, because it's something that will connect them, not because they like military. They have a negative feeling towards military, but it connects Jew to Jew. And I'll use one simple analogy. Look at the exit surveys of the last 20 years of birthright. Most kids who go on birthright are under-affiliated or unaffiliated. And you would think, the number one takeaway was going to be Friday night Shabbat in Yerushalayim. That was number two. The number one takeaway is the mifgash, their encounter with Israelis, Jew to Jew, different cultures, different mentalities, and they just bond. That's their number one takeaway. Our goal is to connect American Jews to Israeli Jews.
And are you successful with this? Is FIDF growing?
Well, we're 4 months in this language that we're using to engage the greater American Jewish community. We've put a lot of. You ever hear the name Lior Arusi?
No.
He is one of our incredible lay leaders. He lives now in Renana. He sold his company here in America, and we've got a number of other people, and we've done some beta testing. We've done some market research. American Jews may not be pro the Netanyahu government. I'm talking about the majority of American Jews. They may not be pro-military. But one thing? That big ocean becomes a very small pond. They connect Jew to Jew. And that I think we can, and again, I apologize for repeating myself. I'm using 20 years of birthright, the last 20 years of birthright. I'm using that as a litmus test or as an example of why we think we can connect with the greater American Jewish community.
And this idea of connecting, how can we use it? You do it with FIDF. How do you see the Orthodox community using that idea? What are we getting? What are we missing from all your work in the OU, and before that, obviously, as a key Rav on the American scene?
What we did in the OU, and we were criticized by many because it was the largest expenditure of anything that we did, was this network called the Jewish Student Union. It was the largest dimension of NCSY. And I'll tell you, we, in a very painful way, we found out, we can't start making the case for Israel the way that you and I were raised in making the case for Israel. We had to speak to a population that was very, not anti-Jewish, but very suspicious of Israel because of the images they had been shown, because of what they'd heard in their parents' home, because of what many of their public school teachers had shared with them. And we learned how to speak a language that connected them. I'm not saying we were perfect, but I'm saying we radically transformed educationally how we engage that population. And that is an unaffiliated population.
So I remember years ago when Soviet Jews first started coming back to the United States, that everyone wanted to be Makarev them. And there was a great article, actually, it was from the Aguda, which said, our goal with this generation is just to keep them Jewish and to hope that the next generation will have opportunities, which is really a way of saying it's a long-term project. I'm sitting, behind me is a picture of my shul, sitting in a school. I get to work with Orthodox committed Jews, both younger and older. But how do we, within our somewhat sheltered community, how do we make that difference that JSU did, that you're doing with FIDF, and on and on? What would you tell a regular balabos that they should try to do?
If I could go into the weeds, I would ask our community. Shabbos lunch is a different story, might be much more of a halachic issue. But I would ask them that every Friday night after COVID, once we get out of COVID, should be basically designated for inviting Jews who wouldn't be having a Friday night dinner. It could be a customer, it could be an employee, it could be a cousin, and that should be the Friday night table. By the way, it'll be the most incredible education for our kids. They'll become stronger. Same thing with Purim, Suda, Mishloach, Manot. Don't give it to each other. Let's give it to a Jew who wouldn't even know it's Purim. And I would say that with much of what we do. I would say something else, that we all have relatives and we all have friends, business acquaintances, clients. Give them interesting Jewish books. Give them some of Jonathan Sacks' Jewish books, like, A Letter in the Scroll. Things like that. Because why? We give gifts anyways. We're going to give a bottle of single malt scotch. We're going to give a box of Godiva chocolates. Give that instead. It's not threatening, and it's stimulating, and it opens doors. It's not preachy, but it opens doors. And I think I'm going to say this, there's no guarantee that someone goes on a birthright and they're going to have an incredible experience. However, if they go on the right birthright, and take Israel Free Spirit, that's the OU birthright, take some of these quality birthrights, I think they will have not a life-changing experience, but I think they'll have an incredible experience that will be a step that will lead to the second or third step. And that second or third step will be the game changer. Things like that. It costs them nothing to go on a birthright. If we can encourage it, it's free. We all have relatives who have kids that age. We all have clients or acquaintances who have kids that age. Things like that. That's from my perspective. I got to say something else that probably isn't so PC. I don't think the Orthodox community is any more dishonest than any other community. The problem is, it's almost like when a priest gets caught as a pedophile, that's what makes the front page of the newspaper. They don't take the average Joe Schmo who's a pedophile and put him in the newspaper. When an Orthodox Jew is engaged in financial impropriety, that always makes the front page of the newspaper. So it's a certain perception out there. If we have to be the people of Choshen Mishpat, that has a huge impression on others. The way we treat our employees, the way we negotiate our deals, the way we follow through on our commitments. In my opinion, if they see an Orthodox Jew who lives by Choshen Mishpat, who lives by Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, Bava Basra, that has an incredible impact on people.
But it's interesting. That's probably one of the least studied areas beyond the theoretical. And all kids are learning one of the Bavas when they're in elementary school. But how many people have ever opened up a Choshen Mishpat? It's it's probably very telling that we've been focusing more on the life cycle, on the Orach Chaim pieces, on the day-to-day life, and not thinking about the business life as well. It's a fascinating take. Uh, I'm going to switch gears for a minute to one of the things that you've been very passionate about it, and that is Iran. We're in a new administration. The new administration is going to take different approaches than previous administration, and that's true of every administration that comes around. Um, where do you think we're headed in the next year or so with the threat of Iran?
Please God, I'm wrong. I think it's a disaster. Meaning, the American administration, the European administrations. The difference is with America, it's not about doing business with Iran. With the Europeans who claim to be moral, I'm so disappointed in their morality. So you don't expect morality from the Russians or the Chinese because they never claim to be moral. But the French, the Germans, the British, you would expect better from them. And they want the business. From an American point of view, they don't want to have to deal with this. They want to punt this thing down the road. But go back to Neville Chamberlain and Hitler, or go back to the French and Hitler. You can't appease and capitulate murderers. You can't appease and capitulate to terrorists. They view that as a sign of weakness. And you see, the Iranians are brilliant. You got to admire their brilliance. I don't mean that in the wrong way because it's evil. What they do is they just keep pushing. It's almost like, I use an analogy. If you go to Soldier Field, an NFL field has a certain width. But in the Canadian Football League, it's a bit wider. So you just keep going into the white zone. And if you see you get away with that, the out of bounds line, you go another 2 inches. And then the Iranians just keep pushing it and pushing it and pushing it. And then before you know it, you have North Korea. Once they have nuclear capability, that's the game changer. And what's happened to me is that first with the Obama administration, and again, this is not pro or con, but with the foreign policy of the Obama administration and the group that's in now, who really were part of that foreign policy, they're driving the Sunni Gulf nations, they're driving them right into Israel because they only can trust and rely on Israel. They cannot trust and rely on the EU or the United States of America. And they're in a much worse shape than we are. The Jews always are attacked first. We're the canary in the coal mine. But the prize is Mecca and Medina. The Saudis know that. And Bahrain is right there in the Gulf, right near Iran. They're scared to death.
So pushing them towards Israel is good for Israel. Not that should ever be the way we have the Abraham Accords or anything else like that. And in the end of the day, Israel has always said if they have to manage things, they will manage things. Is that where you think things might end up?
No one thinks that there's any credible military threat to the Iranians coming from the United States. And I think that's fair. I don't think that's an opinion. I think it's a fair statement. Here's the problem. Let's assume Israel uses, whether it's Azerbaijan, whether it's Saudi Arabia, whether it's someone else. Let's assume that Israel does not have to send jets or submarines just from Israel, that they actually have a closer range to deal with Iran. How do you deal with something like Fordo with cones? It's under literally tens and tens of meters. It's under a mountain. There's no way America with the MOP could penetrate that mountain and take it out. But Israel's not capable. Israel doesn't have the weaponry and it doesn't have the platform to deliver it. So Israel let me put it simply, we better daven to Hashem, because from a point of view of military and strategic, where our hands are tied. We can do damage to Iran. We can't take out all of their installations. It's in God's hands. It's a very precarious place to be.
And shifting once more, let's go back to shul for a moment. You're in Teaneck, and we have a very close mutual friend as your rabbi, Rabbi Baum, and right
who
now,
looks up to you, who views you as a role model and mentor.
once again, I thank you, but Rabbi Baum is wonderful on his own. And you're watching what's going on in the American Orthodox scene in terms of ritual. We're coming up to Pesach. This year we'll be able to have a Seder. Last year, my wife and I sat alone at the table, which wasn't as bad as my mother sitting alone at the table for a Seder. We're going to have a Seder again. I don't know how many people we can have. I don't know the conditions it'll be, but we're beginning to reopen. But synagogue life has changed. And so at KINS, let's just say davening has been streamlined, I think is the nicer way of saying it. There are no mishaberachs. My presidents all agreed with me that the sermon should be cut down shorter to limit the amount of time in shul. Singing is still rare, even though there's some moments we do allow it. And we're going to start coming out of this. In your experience, from your perspective, do you think the new is going to be similar to the old, or is it going to be something very different?
We're going to have to really be creative to bring people back to shul. I'm not talking about our stalwarts, and I'm not talking about the low-hanging fruits. Whether it's interesting shiurim pre and post, whether it's really incredible opportunities for children, which will drag the parents, we're going to have to be, our creativity and the quality of, I hate to say it, it's almost like, I don't mean it as a performance or making it into Disney World, but in terms of the fun, dynamic, educational experiences, not to mention the gastronomical experiences with quality food, we're going to have to up our game, because unfortunately, certain people have gotten into a certain law. Now, the blessing that we have is that our people are social people. That's a good thing in many ways. And bottom line is, on a Shabbos, there's nothing like, coming to shul, because that's where the kids want to be with the great programming, and the adults are there. And then you have the mother-toddler programming, and you have this and that. So at least we'll be the anchor where they'll socialize around, and it'll be the fulcrum, the pivot of what they socialize around. That's the positive. The challenge is going to be, as you said, what kind of services, what kind of programs before and after, what kind of enrichment. You think about many of the shiurim today. We're getting more people to our shiurim on Zoom than we ever did before, because the Zoom opportunity. But what's that going to do for the live attendance? That's going to be a real challenge.
No, we're planning in a couple of weeks, on the 17th, we have a Haggadah workshop at KINS. And we made a decision, it's going to be live and broadcast, because we have enough room. We're going to put it in the main sanctuary, and people will be socially distanced. There'll be plenty of room for that. And that's going to be one of our test cases, to see how many people are going to come in person and how many are going to stay comfortable at home and just watch. And as good as the things are online, as we are right now, it provides opportunity, but it's not the same as the face-to-face. It's not going to be, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Is a shul, I guess, I've watched, I grew up with big shuls like the one I'm in, where there were the big shuls. And then I've watched the shtibilization of shuls. In my neighborhood, when I became a rabbi at KINS, and before that in another shul in the neighborhood of Beth Yitzchak, there were about 10 Orthodox shuls. Now in the same neighborhood, there are 40 Orthodox shuls, and I'm convinced there's definitely a need for about 15 total. But there is also a social need, that everyone has their niche, and this is the way we started moving. Is this going to shift that away from the niches and because the ones who can be creative and can do different things are going to be the ones with the bigger organizations. The little shuls are just going to be able to do the little shul stuff. What's your thinking on that?
Yeah, I'm biased, but I think that the way to attract the people is through having really the most dynamic and exciting youth programming. And then I think there's got to be a lot of special events. There's got to be a lot of niche programming. And the institutions that have the fundraising capabilities of funding those kind of programs, they'll get the people. Mm-hmm. Because bottom line is, kids want to play with other kids. They don't want to play on Zoom. And that's where you get them. And a lot of the shtibels don't even have the facilities. The kids just run around. Whereas, you have a facility with great dynamic role models. They can get substance. They can have fun. There's always the food component. And then the parents come. I'm being simplistic about it, but I think that's the number one hook, and that's got to be the number one focus. And then I think some really interesting niche programming, which is not necessarily something that you're going to do every week or every, special niche programming. It could have a history component, it could have a cooking component, it could have a philosophy component, it could have, certain personalities component. It's just, I hate to say this because they don't train us to be programmers in smicha. That's not why we go to get smicha. But we almost have to be these incredible dynamic programmers and have a network of Orthodox Rabbanim and Orthodox laity that will, instead of recreating the wheel, we'll take the model that was used at Kins and we'll apply it to us, or the model that was used by Keter Torah and Rabbi Baum and apply it to Kins.
Well, that we do find some of that happening. You and I were speaking before we started about some of the things coming out of the Mizrahi, where you'll have a program and they'll be able to change one piece for the individual shul and then provide this larger program that an individual shul couldn't manage. And YU has done some of that as well. The Orthodox Union has done some of those things as well. But it's all about the kids. If we get the kids in, we'll get the parents. And the food has to be good. We're going back. One of these days, we'll go back to Cholent every Shabbos. And I just hope that the people who are coming are not the JFK crew. Okay, for those who don't know, JFK is just for Kiddush. It has nothing to do with the Kennedy clan. But the reality is we have a big challenge in front of us. Do we have the leadership nationally? Do we have the infrastructure nationally? And I'll give one last piece. I was speaking recently with the editorial board of a large evangelical publication. And there was a conservative rabbi, a reform rabbi, and myself. And the question they were describing, each of us were describing our own groups. And it was my turn. I said, I have to apologize. We don't have a movement. We are the most disorganized of anything because we're grassroots. Orthodoxy doesn't have the one person on top besides God. But we do have organizations that do help. Is that the way to go? Or do we have that kind of structure? We need to look at something bigger nationally.
Our Yetzer Hara, I quote Rabbi Weil, a fellow Chicagoan, Habamos lo saru, they couldn't remove, the best of the kings of the Malchei Yehuda couldn't remove the private altars. So our shtibels are the bamos. It's our Yetzer Hara, our flaw is that everybody has to mach Shabbos for zech. They joke about Israel. Israel has more companies on the NASDAQ than anyone other than China and America. And Israel's a fraction of the size. But Israel could never produce a Nokia, never produce an Amazon or an Apple, because every Jew's got a mach Shabbos for zech, right? Every Jew has to do their own thing. That's the challenge. That's the flaw that we have as a people, our Yetzer Hara. In that being the case, that no one is going to adopt. Look, the Aguda, they're great people. The people involved in the Aguda are great people. They don't represent anybody. There's no one who's looking to the Aguda. It's a little bit different with the OU. But what we have, though, in the yeshivish world, in the modernish world, the centrist world, in the Hasidish world, and we also interlap. It's beautiful. There's a tremendous interlap that we have in all of our worlds today. And we have a network. So it's not institutionalized. It's not formal, like the Pope is giving the following sermon or the Pope is giving the following message. But what we're incredible about, and that's where we turn to you, Rabbi Matenki, is the network. We just feel so comfortable talking to each other. Hey, what worked for you? Or what's happening in Chicago? Or what could we learn from Chicago? Or you might want to try this in West Rogers Park. That's what we have that I think our strength is the network.
And that network is the reason I was able to reach out to you for today as well. It's over the years, we have been able to meet people and to work with people. And it's an extraordinary thing to imagine. And a lot of people imagine that we're siloed in the Orthodox community, that either you're a centrist or you're a Chassidish or you're a Haredi or you're this or you're that. And the reality is, the more involved you get, the more your connections cross all sorts of lines. And Rabbi Weil, you're a perfect example of a person who has been in so many different worlds, still yourself throughout. Our time is up. I enjoyed this tremendously. We've been all over the world in this conversation, starting back on the farm. But I am so grateful for your leadership and for all of the amazing things that you do. And I'm very jealous of the friends of the IDF that they convinced you to come over and lead them to new great heights. And I know they will get to new great heights. So you should continue to work on behalf of the Chayalim.
I have to give a shout out, a quick shout out to my peer who's oversees the whole the Midwest, Tamir Oppenheim, and to some of the founders of the Chicago Midwest region, Al Frank, we got Al Brody, Izzy Levy, Chezi Levy. They're really what these men and women have done in terms of just education of building the future of the Jewish nation. You know, I think historically we'll be profoundly grateful. They created the whole impact scholarship system, and 17,000 young people who could have never afforded a university education, first time in the history of their family, anyone who went to university, it all came out of Chicago. So FIDF, you know, Chicago is a role model to all of us in the FIDF family.
Well, thank you to know that. That's amazing. And some of those names are pillars of our community as well, the general community as well. Rabbi, thank you. Stay safe. It's not too early to wish you a Chag Kosher v'Sameach, and continue to lead us to great new heights. Have a wonderful. Bye-bye.